Who are these people? Where did they come from? Why do they hate us? There was a total loss of collective narrative. We were not living in the world that we thought we lived in. And we kept hearing from our political leaders that everything we thought we understood before the attacks no longer applied. There was a new phrase, pre-9/11 thinking. And what happened in that moment is that suddenly news stories sort of magically appeared. That we were in a clash of civilizations. That's the world that we suddenly lived in. That there was an axis of evil, and that we were fighting a war against terror.
This abstract, unwinnable war has had huge economic consequences. Before 2001, Homeland Security barely registered as an industry. Today, it is bigger than Hollywood and the music industry combined. Between September the 11th, 2001 and 2006, the Department of Homeland Security handed out $130 billion to private contractors. This is the disaster capitalism complex, a new economy built on fear.
This will be a monumental struggle of good versus evil.
The best defense against terror is a global offensive against terror, wherever it might be found.
The first phase of this war was the bombing of Afghanistan. The Taliban government was quickly overthrown. The aftermath of the war was more complicated.
Our fight against terrorism began in Afghanistan, but it will not end there.
We're primarily looking at detainees that we can use. We're collecting intelligence.
Guantanamo was the first time that the techniques of the Kubark Manual were explicitly and publicly being used by American forces, officially sanctioned in the White House and openly broadcast on television around the world.
Isolation, both physical and psychological, must be maintained from the moment of apprehension. The capacity for resistance is diminished by disorientation. Prisoners should maintain silence at all times. They should never be allowed to speak to each other.
3 of the prisoners were Asif Iqbal, Ruhal Ahmed and Shafiq Rasool from Tipton in England. They spent more than 2 years in Guantanamo before being released without charge.
Mentally, yeah, you couldn't speak to nobody, you couldn't do nothing, you couldn't stand up. And just sitting there, you'd be in your thoughts all the time thinking, what the hell's going on, where the hell am I? And we're going to be staying here for the rest of our lives, and we're going to be going back home. Will we ever see our family again?
Of the 779 prisoners that have been held in Guantanamo Bay, only 3 have ever been convicted of any offence.
Well, the only thing I know for certain is that these are bad people.
It was a message to the whole world, and the message was clear. It was, this is what happens to you if you get in our way.
The war on terror is not about one man, and it is not about one country.
There were many justifications given for the invasion of Iraq. But if the US had really wanted to attack a country where the leaders of Al-Qaeda were thought to be hiding, which had nuclear weapons and was selling nuclear technology to other countries, then Pakistan would have been the obvious choice. It had close connections to the Taliban and was being run by a military dictator. Instead, George Bush chose to target Iraq, a country with the 3rd largest oil reserves in the world.
Now, about the Defense Department's war plan. It is not like that for the Gulf War. It's more along the lines of the Panama invasion of 1989. CBS News has been told it would start on what's called A-Day. A as in airstrikes. Airstrikes so devastating, they would leave Saddam's soldiers unable or unwilling to fight. The idea is to rain down the thunder so hard as to create, quote, shock and awe. If the Pentagon sticks to its current war plan, one day in March, the Air Force and Navy will launch between 300 and 400 cruise missiles at targets in Iraq. More than were launched during the entire 40 days of the first Gulf War. The sheer size of this has never been seen before, never been contemplated before. Harlan Ullman is one of the authors of the shock and awe concept, which relies on large numbers of precision-guided weapons.
So that you have this simultaneous effect, rather like the nuclear weapons at Hiroshima, not taking days or weeks, but in minutes. You also take the city down. By that I mean you get rid of their power, their water, and you begin this relentless campaign to wear them down so that 2, 3, 4, 5 days they are physically, emotionally, and psychologically exhausted.
Last night, a square mile in central Baghdad seemed like hell on earth.
During the first wave of the bombing, the citizens of Baghdad suffered a version of the sensory deprivation described in the Kubark manual. In the chaos that followed the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, the US did little to stop the looting. Some US officials even thought it gave them a head start on dismantling the Iraqi state. John Agresto, Director of Higher Education Reconstruction, said he saw the looting of schools as the opportunity for a clean start. In fact, before sanctions, Iraq had the best education system in the region. 89% of Iraqis were literate. By contrast, in New Mexico, John Agresto's home state, 46% of the population were functionally illiterate.
In Iraq, you had 3 distinct forms of shock that were all working together and reinforcing each other. You had the shock of the war, which was immediately followed by economic shock therapy imposed under Paul Bremer. And as resistance to that economic transformation, that very rapid economic shock grew, you had the shock of enforcement, including torture. 3 different kinds of shock.
In May 2003, Paul Bremer was appointed US envoy to Iraq. 2 weeks after he arrived, he declared the country open for business.
We considered that the coalition had very broad authorities to determine the direction of the Iraqi economy.
Bremer knew little of Iraq, but he knew about disaster capitalism. He had launched crisis consulting practice at the start of the Homeland Security boom.
Today is a very important day in Baghdad.
Bremer spent the first 4 months passing classic Chicago school laws. Rumsfeld described Iraq as having some of the most enlightened and inviting tax and investment laws in the free world. One of the first acts of Bremer was to fire 500,000 state workers. This was partly an act of debartification, but slashing governments was also vintage Friedman. Money was promised for reconstruction.
Our investment in the future of Afghanistan and Iraq is the greatest commitment of its kind since the Marshall Plan.
But in fact, it was just the opposite. Whereas the Marshall Plan was intended to boost European industries, US aid money in Iraq was spent on US corporations. If work came to Iraqis, it came at the bottom of a series of subcontractors. Creative Associates received contracts worth $100 million to draft the curriculum and print new textbooks for the education system. Management and technology consultant Bearing Point was awarded contracts worth $240 million to build a market-driven system in Iraq. North Carolina-based RTI received contracts worth $466 million to advise on bringing democracy to Iraq. And Halliburton was awarded $20 billion in cost-plus Iraqi contracts. Parsons was handed $186 million to build 142 health clinics. Only 6 were ever completed. And basic electricity and water supplies hardly